to hear our story of Lakeview. We'd like for you to know our museum board members who made this all possible. Mitch Stock is our president. He's probably still outside riding around on the golf cart. Kay Montano is our vice president, and she's a librarian. She's probably working tonight. Janet Frisbee is here. She is our purse keeper, the treasurer. And Marilyn Kaiser, you're right here, is our record keeper, and boy does she keep records. She's the secretary. The board members include Peggy Durner, Richard Stuffragan, he was parking cars, and Deb Shodden is in the back. She's our researcher. You ask her anything and she can find it, even if it's 100 years old. And Karen Van Beveren, she was at the door to greet you. And me, I'm Jane Kroll. This gathering grew out of Dr. Jon Quinn's presentation of the history of anesthesiology, which he gave in April, and it was sponsored by the library. And what happened there was the library wasn't big enough, so we moved to the Methodist Church. This gave us an idea that people would like to hear good information. And John gave such an interesting talk that we asked him to research and give the history of Lakeview. You'll learn things tonight you've never known about our beautiful town and Black Hawk Lake. So what better person to tell the story than Dr. Jon Quinn, class of '82, and he's our Lakeview own boy. I can guarantee that this will be a whopper of a story.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Thank you to the board. The railroad was essential in the development of this town. Our town's founded in 1880. That's the only number you need to remember tonight, 1880. And just 15 years prior to that, 1865, it's the close of the Civil War. We've lost Lincoln. But it was that summer that they started building the Transcontinental Railroad, west from Omaha, out through the Rockies into California. When they started building that track, there still wasn't a track across Iowa to meet it. But there was 2 years later, and by 1870 there were 4, and one of these was the Chicago Northwestern, which is it's now the UP, but it goes through Glidden and Carroll and Arcadia, West Side and Vail. And it was then that people first started settling here along the south side and the east side of the lake. One of these early settlers was Platt Armstrong. He came here from eastern Iowa with 4 sons. And a couple hard seasons, winters, growing seasons, but he decides to build a frame house. And he has lumber delivered to the nearest station there is, Vail. And he has one of his sons go pick up this lumber with a wagon and a horse. 4 days later, he's made 2 trips. There's one bridge, there's no roads. And I think he even had a portage at one point. So you can only do so much with a horse and a buggy, and contrast that with a track coming into the center of your town. A locomotive with 20 or 40 cars, bringing all the materials that a town needs. Lumber, coal, people, and also to be able to take out a couple products we'll talk tonight about, and plus agricultural products, grain and livestock. But each train car is capable of carrying about 200,000 pounds, and so it's no comparison. In 1877, the Northwestern Railroad starts building north from Maple River. And they come up north through Breda and then Carnarvon, and then they veer west to Wall Lake and Otable. We've been a county and a state for several decades, since 1846. But when Sac City found out they weren't getting this track, they went to, there's a number of contractual and legal issues here, but they asked that they build an extension from Wall Lake to Sac. There was a financial issue where the railroad said, if you local farmers do the grading from Wall Lake to Sac, we'll lay the track. And that's done in 1879, 1880. And our new friend, Platt Armstrong, thinks this would be an ideal place for a town. And he took it upon himself to go directly to the Northwestern executives. And he was told that if you build the side tracks, and if you build the depot, and if you plat out the town, Platt, there's nothing in that contract that says that we won't recognize that as a station and a stop on our railroad. And so that track laid like 1879 and 80. A friend of his was James Fletcher, somebody he did business with in Wall Lake. And the Fletcher family had land in this area, and so those are the two founders of our town, Armstrong and Fletcher. And it's in the fall, October of 1880, they plat out the town. The town is dedicated under the name Fletcher, and there's a few reasons for that. The town grows rapidly. In 1882, it's estimated that the population is 300 people, and I count 23 concerns, businesses, on Main Street, and they're all on the north end. The depot is just south across from the lumber yard, up by 5th Street. And but think of an old Western movie. There's 2 elevators, there's the lumber yard, there's a hotel, hardware, furniture, pharmacist, restaurant, saloon in the Western, right? Blacksmiths, wagon fixers, and the like. The formal paperwork, we'd never been formally incorporated, and that paperwork's not done in the courthouse until 1887. And Mr. Fletcher's not playing such a role in here. He's certainly a founder, but not a promoter of the town and having the presence that Platt Armstrong and his family did for several generations. And so the name suggested was Lakeview when we incorporated. There weren't many trees in town, and it was said that you could see the lake from almost any place in town. So it's a nice sounding name, Lakeview, Iowa, our home. We get a newspaper in 1889. That man's name is Wilson Hamilton. And if I think they had 600 or 700 copies a week, and if you read between the lines, I think he's pretty harried. He has 4 or 5 terms over the next 15 years or so. And everybody knew this was going to be a resort town. And Lakewood is built in 1891. And there's also about 14 cottages for rent out there too. It grows. There's a number of owners over the years, and by the turn of the century, you've got the hotel, but now about 40 cottages for rent. But there's a beer hall, a skating hall, and a dance hall out there as well. I'm trying to give this talk without using too many proper names. But the Whelan family acquires Lakewood. And in 1913, this becomes a full-scale amusement park. And, there's a store, restaurants, a tea room that's on your handout. There's a soda fountain room that looks very nice in the Centennial book. It's like 2 tiers and brass railings and mirrors behind the bar and things. Rides. There's amusement rides and concessionaires and a popcorn stand, boat rentals, there's the beach. There's a bandstand. There'd be speakers in town, senators and such, and about every governor, at least 5, are mentioned in the Centennial book. Probably every governor's been here over the years, resort town. There's also a baseball field at Lakewood that we'll talk about, and lest I forget, there's about 2,000 or 3,000 people at some of these baseball games, quite regularly. And later there's a golf course built in 1927. Series of fires at Lakewood over the years. There's a real bad one in 1936, and that's of course during the Depression. They rebuilt the dance hall, and there was skating offered there into the 40s and 50s. I call this the Ballroom Era, rightly or not. People drive 50 miles and spend an evening at the ballrooms, you know, Roof Garden and Surf Ballroom and that. The last fire that puts an end to the wooden Lakewoods occurs on Thursday, May 29th, 1980. And I was hoping there'd be a child in the front row, but nobody's saying anything about that. I was going to say, somebody's supposed to say, Quinn, you're a silly goose. You're right. The reason I remember that was my birthday. And 16's when you could get your license, and normally you get your license in Sac, but they were closed for some reason. I begged my mother to drive me to Pocahontas, Iowa. She done so. And I must have passed because my friend David Kessel and I were driving around in my car that evening south of town, and we saw smoke over on Lakewood Point. We're going to scoot through this next section on the infrastructure. I, for one, am not bent that way too much. The Centennial book is outstanding. And for those of you that are interested in this type, the electricity and the sewage and that, there's like 2 pages on each of those 4 topics. And it's everything from the city's decisions and the votes, the financing, the logistics of bringing those things into town. 2 observations of mine. It seems like it's about 20 years after an invention and innovation that those things become a household appliance type thing, whether it's a telephone or refrigeration, alternating current. And the other thing, of course, is those dates will tell you it's 1915 or whatever until they're using kerosene lamps and chamber pots, and so more directed for children if we had them. But I was going to say, if you're like me, you'll walk in a room and flip the switch and you don't think much about it. But that's a sequence of end of a long sequence of events, and there's a lot of people past and present to thank for that. I purposely stayed away from 2 topics. They're just too big to discuss. One is agriculture. These deserve their own talks. And the other one's a community club, but I'll briefly mention the community club. Check out the Centennial book. They've done more to promote this town, and commerce, of course, but Main Street and parks from the get-go, 1881. But there's 2 businesses that are a little more unusual, and they're related to the train, and the second one especially for historical interest. The gravel industry. This was a big deal, and it was said that if you were on, the first company is the Northwest Railroad Company, subsidiary of the railroad, and they assayed north of town, and there are granite and sand deposits there, but of course the best deposits are south of town where all the pits are at and have been for over a century. Big business. It was said that if you were on a road in northwest Iowa, the odds that that sand, that gravel came from here was very high. And it wasn't uncommon to have 60, 63 train cars of gravel on one train, you see. And who knows how many employees, probably 1,000 if you count the gravel companies and the concrete companies and the vault companies and trucking and everything over the years. There were 4 or 5 companies. There was a LeGrand Sandstone Company from south central Iowa. They sold to Hallett's in 1939. And so Hallett's Materials, quite certain out of Minnesota. It's had a presence here now for 80 years. The other company that we might forget about now is the ice making company. And this goes way back to 1890 and persists even into the 1950s. Again, a big business. Thousands of cars of ice left this town over the years. One year somebody had a contract for 125 train cars in Kansas City. In another year, there were 500 cars total that left this town of ice from the lake. Gravel's heavy, and you need a train for that. Well, water and ice are heavy as well, and it was a big deal just to get the ice a mile or less, whatever it is, from the lake to the railroad, to the depot. And one year there was a strike. Those ice wagons wanted like 15 cents a load instead of 12 cents a load, and the man who had the ice company wasn't able to pay it because of freight expenses. And I don't know what happened that year, but the next year we put a railroad spur in over on south of the lake. And so I guess that puts an end to the ice wagon strikes. Again, big business, 40 to 90 employees, and this isn't just seasonal. I understand a lot of this ice was used in homes and businesses here and in surrounding counties, but a majority of this ice went to the railroads. In fact, you can consider the ice an agricultural product, really, because I know it isn't, but you're harvesting the ice and it's helping put food on the table, you know, hundreds of miles from here safely, food preservation. Oh, I had a good story for the kids about the school too, but that was completely fabricated. Ask me later if you want to hear me. We've had schools from the get-go. Initially in 1881, these were in homes. And I was surprised to hear that on my property there was a one-room schoolhouse. And later there was a two-room schoolhouse, upper classes and the lower classes up where the community building is. There was a two-story house at 4th and Madison. The dates aren't given in the Centennial book. I could be wrong about this, but I was out at Ryan's a few weeks ago, and right behind the cashier there's a photo, and it says Lakeview School, and it looks like a church. It's a two-story building, and like a steeple, I suppose, a bell to ring for the kids. But growing town, growing needs, growing educational needs, and land is acquired from the Broughtons in 1915, and the old high school, it's that southernmost block. The school's built to the north, of course, but it's a darker brick, and that's the initial school, 1916. I'm fond of that image of the cornerstone, and if you go up there tomorrow, there's Armstrongs and Ketterings on that. It was the school board members and other names that you'd recognize. In 1938, the gymnasium's made and built, and at least partially that came from CCC funds, one of the work groups. At some point, I need to tell you, there's an absolutely terrific DVD available at the library somebody put together, and it's 1938 and 1939. It shows the gymnasium of the school being built. There's men on overalls up on the top, and I didn't watch it preparing for this, but I watched it a couple years ago. It seemed like the trees were below them and things, but they're actually like laying the bricks. It shows Main Street. Wish we had kids. I was going to tell them about Santa Claus, but and somebody's running for office, and it's a senator or somebody that fall. It's also the year of the dredging project. Several things we're going to talk about tonight, and I call them pontoon bridges, but it's a series of rafts and then the piping, you know, the tubing to get the silt ashore. And it shows the CCC camps out at Lakewood, and the guys marching like to their mess hall in single file and things. I was actually looking for my father. He would have been 12 or 13, and everything I've told you about takes about 30 minutes on that DVD. Well, if you're not looking for my father, you can pull out the DVD because it goes on about another half hour. There's hundreds of schoolboys and dozens of country schools. He went to one between here and Carnival. And I've had fun telling people that it shows all these boys in their overalls, and they come out the front step of the school and they stand at the camera like this, and then they go like this. So it goes on for 30 minutes. You laugh the first time, so it is. What's that? No, one-room schoolhouses. Those persisted into the 1950s, by the way, and I think you know, high school for my father would have been here at 44, but people know about this more than me, but I think Iowa education was revamped in the 1950s and kind of put an end to that. The spring of 1917 brings us the Great War. And early April we entered the war. This war changed the world, and I don't think it's much conjecture to say that it would have changed these pioneers. The world had never seen anything like this before. All prior wars had been cavalries, horses. And at once, there's tanks and machine guns, submarine warfare, Big Berthas, and to some extent, aerial bombing. And really, this isn't long after the Wright brothers and that. The statistics, I can be a little less careful with my words here. They're staggering. They're all in the millions and the tens of millions. Do we have children here? Anyway, I need to be careful about it. It's 5 million civilians. It's 5 million people in battle, and it's 21 million wounded. It's a little hard to get your mind around it. But the worst news is there was the last 2 years of that war, the 4th and 5th years, there was an epidemic of pneumonia, influenza, and a pandemic. It's global. And there's several hot spots. But this is completely related to the war because you got this mass movement of people and people in close proximity and malnourished people at that point. I've heard several estimates, and it'll be anywhere from 20 to 50 million or 50 to 100 million. So I think we can say 50 million people died of pneumonia. Interestingly, in the United States, we were actually losing more people, per like month or week from pneumonia than we were men in Europe. And we were losing more men in Europe from pneumonia than we were from combat. And but we're talking about Lakeview. In 1910, the census is just a little over 500 people. And we contributed 83 people to that war. That's enormous, because if you figure half of those people are women, you're down to 250, and then you throw out the 70-year-olds and the kindergartners. It's a very high percentage of men. It's similar for World War II. In 1940, the census is something over 1,000, and it's 254 men from this town go to Europe and the Pacific. Our first loss in that war is Eilert Allen. The Allens were from Carnarvon Way. The dad's name's Eilert too. Who we're talking about, he's born in 1895, so he's 23 at this point. He's out at Ferguson Cemetery. Our family is Wall Lake for church and cemetery and that, and so I hadn't been out here much. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Fergusons and Ferguson Cemetery. This family goes way back, the Fergusons. They come here from western Ohio, Lima, and Charlie, he's like 5th generation, maybe even 6th, and he's born in about 1920, so this is deep. And the patriarch's name's Elijah, but he's not here so much. He's back in Ohio and California and things. I think he's out here at the cemetery too. But his son Abner plays a big role here, and I'll tell you about the start of the cemetery, but he lives till like 1927 or something and gives that land to the town or the township. But Abner had a sister who married a man named Ruggles. And I think this was in Ohio, but they had a little girl named Marietta. And she was only like 3 years old. Well, she loses both of her parents to death. I mean, they died separately, and they both died. It sounds a little unusual. And they adopt this niece. Well, when they get here, this girl dies of scarlet fever. And their section, of course, is out here where the cemetery is, and Charlie and Bill lived. They found a tree on the east side of that section, and they thought that would be a good place for Marietta to be buried. The Centennial book says that another couple lost children, plural, will assume that it's 2, of the same disease shortly after that, and they asked that these children be together. And so that's the beginning of Ferguson Cemetery. If I got any book club friends, ask me about scarlet fever. There's something we read about a month ago. Also, we've got a unknown soldier. The story behind that is, the date's not given, I would guess this is early in the 1870s too. Somebody was building a lane or a drive or something. They're moving soil, and they came across a body of an unknown, but he had on a uniform, and they could tell from his buttons that he was a Northern soldier. So we have a true United States Union soldier as our unknown soldier. But it's a mystery, apparently he died here, and so we don't know the circumstances. He's unknown. Also, your numbers are off a little bit on your handout. It's not 13 and 1 for the first 2 wars. It's 23 and 2. I missed a column. But 1 in the Centennial book of the Civil War veterans is marked with an asterisk. And he's a Confederate. And I was kind of glad to see that, actually. I read a few years ago that there weren't any national cemeteries in the South until like the McKinley administration in the 1890s, and that's not right, because that caused a lot of problems for women and those families afterwards. And we've got these beautiful cemeteries up north, and I understand the opposite argument is they were trying to break up the Union, but that's for men who died in combat in the Civil War, but this is different from that. But anyway, this man's treated well. Eilert Allen is out there. I'm curious about his reburial, if anybody knows about that. I'm guessing that was a year or 2 later. He's lost he's the first of our losses, but it's near the end of the war. It's the summer of 1918. Dr. Speaker's out there, Everett Speaker. It's kind of neat. I'd be glad to give a cemetery tour. It's show you all. They had one down in Woodland, down in Des Moines. It was fascinating. A lot of the things we're talking about, kind of. But Dr. Speaker has his signature on his stone, and I'll be under a tree in Wally, but I know some celebrities that have done that, so I'm thinking I do. Clyde Armstrong's out there, happens to be a Civil War veteran too, and there's more to that story. But we'll keep moving. And the Fergusons are out there, Abner and Elijah. But Confederate, the unknown, little Marietta Ruggles. But I count, well, it was 556, but maybe it's a few higher than that with the numbers I just gave you. 557 men from this town have served in war, but it's actually a lot higher than that have been affiliated with the military, because that doesn't include anybody born after the 1950s and these more recent wars in the Middle East and Bosnia and that. It also doesn't include anybody who served during peacetime or in the reserves, and it doesn't include anybody who's relocated here since 1980, because that's when the book's printed. So it's probably 900 or 1,000 men. So let it be said, when the world and the nation's gone to war, this town has contributed in every way and every sacrifice of delayed careers and delayed families and ultimate sacrifices. Well, you're wondering, is Lakeview, you know, what we've discussed, that's part of the world and it's part of Lakeview, and we need to know it and remember it. But there's more to Lakeview than just working on the train. And there's more to Lakeview than hauling coal. And I was going to tell the kids the only fun thing we've discussed so far is school. But we know that we're to be well-rounded people and to share our lives with our neighbors in the community and to be healthy citizens and to learn something of the nicer things in life. And we're going to call this next section Culture and Society, an area that I think, for us, compared to other small rural towns in Iowa, I think we've kind of been pretty advanced in. Because people want to dance, and they want to learn how to cook, and they like their beer halls. Now, we're up to 1919 and the Gentlemen of the American Legion, but keep in mind that it's next year the feds are taking away all the beer halls from Maine to San Diego, and that's going to include Lakewood. And I got a friend down by Halber, so we'll get around that. The American Legion's done an awful lot of things for this, for younger people nationally and here. They're founded just that summer after the armistice in 1919. All kinds of national and local groups. Well, I meant to say about the American Legion, you used to not be able to enter this town without seeing a sign that said, "Drive slow in Lakeview. We care about our children." And if we have any Legionnaires, I got a suggestion where you can hang that sign again if you got it and borrow someplace. Odd Fellows, Masons, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, hobby groups, bridge clubs. There's dozens of organizations in a big part of this community over here. But what I'd like to talk about is the women's groups, and there's the four that you see there that merged in 1951. They all have their own purpose, and all of these groups have a social function to share things you have shared experience and interest with. For the women's groups, it's, you know, things in the home and study groups and that. But they're all civic-minded, and it's town beautification and Main Street and cemeteries and children and all these different issues. But one of these four groups I'd like to mention is the Priscilla group. They actually go back earlier to 1906. And they thought in early 1920s that this is a good time to start a library. And think of it for this town. We're past these pioneers. The war's over, the economy's good in this country. And it's a big time for publishing here. But we've got our utilities now, we've got our high school, so we can look forward to other things. They went to the town and asked for help, and did they get help? No. Did they quit? No. They went door to door, and they raised $53 or something. And the community building's not built until 1934. And there's two homes sort of on Main Street for the library prior to that. The first one is it says the public restroom in the staff building. And the other one is there's a brick building that's mentioned several times in the Centennial book behind the bank that's no longer there. It served a lot of functions, but that also was the library at some point. But in 1934 with the community building, they moved there. But they get shuffled around. They're in the clerk's office and that. They do get like $50 from the city in 1925. In 1941, that summer, they become a free public library, and that's a distinction that I think brings in bureaucracy in that, but it also reminds you of all the, there's a lot of functions of a town library other than just lending books, and it's got all the responsibilities of the head librarian. There's about a dozen of them, and it's things from annual events and calling out books, and even things like the bulletin board, and the article in the paper is part of that. But, can appreciate the head librarian. But in 1968, the town decides to build a firehouse, and that vacates the northwest corner of the main floor of the community building. And the town puts $12,000 into that library, and I think that's probably the first time that we really had a library. You need to have a place to browse, and you know, they had traffic patterns and nooks and furniture and that type of thing. You don't just stand in the middle of a room and read a book. And I've learned and been aware in recent years that's important even in homes. I mean, to have a nook or a den and a recliner and things, if you're a reader or a student, study girls. Yeah. First library I was ever in, and I remember the northwest corner of that northwest corner was the children's corner. Guess what's next? Baseball. The book Seabiscuit talks about the three major sports in the 1930s were horse racing, boxing, and baseball. And a hero of mine's a documentarian, Ken Burns, and I've seen most of the things he's made the last 30 years or more. But every few years I watch the documentary on baseball, and it's a commitment because it's almost 20 hours. Each shows, he has a 2-hour show on each decade, but it's how American history is interwoven with the game of baseball. And so, for example, with civil rights, he'll talk about Jackie Robinson, or with labor issues, you know, the Depression, everything. But baseball's also played a big role in this town. Was there a question? It was said in the 1890s that 3 games would be going on a Sunday afternoon. Here in town, a game out of Lakewood, and a game out of Cottage Grove, East End. And the Centennial book, with only one mention of high schools, I'll mention that now. At 1926, it said we won the state high school baseball championship. So if John Kraft or anybody's here, I'm kind of curious in seeing that trophy. But they're not talking about baseball teams. They're talking about there's a county league, and later there's a county businessman's league. So it's kind of, you know, it's the towns north of here. And the following sounds okay to me. You want good players on your team, and they said if you were a good baseball player, you were guaranteed a summer job. Because you go to that town and they give you a job with the expectation that you're going to be playing, you know, on the weekend. Well, somebody thought that wasn't fair, and so then the next year you had to be from that town. We also have semi-pro teams, I think similar to what's in Carroll now, that was actually organized between Wall Lake and Lakeview, and the team was called the Lakes, and that's college players and ex-professional players. But what I'm very interested in right now is, and I think I kind of made a rediscovery on this, it says in the Centennial book, the high water mark for baseball in this town is in the early 20s, when an ex-Chicago baseball player by the name of Lefty Williams played here for our team. That name rang a bell to me. And I was thinking Hall of Fame and that, well, he ain't in the Hall of Fame. Lefty Williams was on the Chicago Black Sox. In 1919, there were 8 players that were banned for baseball for life for accepting money and playing in the World Series. Now, this was certainly known then. And I've got a Spencer beating us 10-1, and they talk about the embarrassed baseball player. They beat Lakeview 10-1, and Lefty gave up 3 homers. If you've seen Field of Dreams, that's shoeless Joe Jackson. Well, he's one of those 8 players too. And the reason I think I kind of rediscovered this, unless Bob Cleveland or somebody knows, I've never heard this story before. And the Centennial book's printed in 1980, and these movies, 8 Men Out and Field of Dreams, aren't until almost 10 years later. But when I first heard about this, I kind of had a pit in my stomach, and I said, my God, this is awful. Lefty Williams, one of the most infamous baseball players in history, was playing here. And then I thought, well, usually there's 2 sides to the story. There is indeed 2 sides to this story, and that movie, 8 Men Out's very good. And somebody wants to get me 8 Men Out the book, or there's several books on the Black Sox. These players weren't treated well. Players didn't have any rights. This guy was off to a Hall of Fame career, and I can ramble on about him for about an hour, but he was 82 and 48 when this happened, and none of these guys were crooks. 2 of the players weren't that sharp, but the whole thing was kind of a mix-up. They weren't even getting paid for the games they threw, and they were trying to win at the end. And in Lefty's defense, before the last game, he was 0-3 in that World Series, and this is a guy who had 2 back-to-back 20-game seasons. And it said that he was threatened with a gun the night before that game, the last game in that series, that his wife's life was threatened. And so I've gone from thinking this is an embarrassment and awful to now thinking that we should look for the good in Lefty Williams. If you remember, we should start a fan club for him or something. If you remember the movie, Shoeless Joe, now this part's fictionalized, but he says, is this heaven? And Kevin Costner says, no, this is Iowa. Well, Lefty Williams chose to play here, and maybe he likes swimming in the lake or something, but it's, there's a lot of teams in the United States that would have been glad to have Lefty Williams in his 20s pitching for him. Who likes movies? Me too. Wish we had more kids. I was going to tell them I think it's a good way to learn a story, and it's kind of like a book, and maybe there's places you can't go, but we can learn about people and places from movies as well. Well, they liked movies 100 years ago too. And if I said we're 10, 20 years behind on innovations and inventions and that, we're kind of ahead of the curve really on movies, and I'll tell you why. They were showing, if you look at the old plat maps, and I've seen these for State Center in several towns in Iowa, they always have an opera house. And ours was where the Kettering and Bonekamp Air and McCall office is. But they were showing movies there in the Assembly Hall. They'd have a tent where the community building is. And also out of Lakewood they showed movies. But this is all prior to the new opera house on Main Street. And that's in 1914, and I haven't seen it, but there's a silent classic called Birth of a Nation, which is on reconstruction. It's a 4-star movie. I kind of prepared this with children in mind, and I was going to say, if you watch those silent movies now, they couldn't sync the voice with it, and so they'd have music on it if you watch it on the DVD now. Well, in big towns back then, they'd have an orchestra, but in smaller towns, they'd have an organist or a piano player. And the Centennial book mentions 3 pianists from this town that, they'd be up in front playing the piano and looking at the screen and playing something fast if there's a chase scene. So that's for 15, 16 years until the sound movies come out around 1930. The first television is sold in town in 1949. It's a Zenith at Parkinson's Furniture, and I was surprised that, we're not a large town, that the theater on Main Street was closed several times in the 1950s and 60s. And there's a big fire that puts an end to the theater. Saturday, April 15th, 1967, and it was in the Holston building on the west side of Main Street, and it took out a lot of companies. And but the theater had actually been closed from New Year's that year, so it had been closed for 3.5 months. I'd like to close this section with Yvonne Dewar, Mrs. Dewar, had 2 pages on the arts. And maybe you'd expect this with thousands of people coming through a town. But, we had an instructor from Juilliard our nation's leading fine arts school from this town. Somebody played with the Guy Lombardo Orchestra. And I don't know the details of that. I think a rock tour is in my mind rings. But it probably was a big deal. People traveled 50, 100 miles to hear the band, and maybe they got to record and things. But Mrs. Zewers, she mentions, she names about a dozen authors from this town. But she talks about how, say in Des Moines, if somebody asked me where I was from, I said, well, I'm halfway to Sioux City. I said, we're 100 miles from anywhere, a big town, we're an airport, another resort, or anything. But Mrs. Dewar talks about how an environment like this, that isn't a 24-hour culture, how that might be conducive to reading and authorship. Trying not to mention too many names, but my patroness tonight is Mrs. Mary Jane Irwin Kroll and her mother Annabelle, and Bernice Rada, who I know would easily be our most acclaimed authors. And they wrote dozens, I'm sure, of books, including Hawkeye Adventure, which was required reading for a 4th grader in this school up here. That was Iowa history. And then we got to go see the Capitol at the end of the semester. October 1929 brings us the Depression. And Tuesday, October 29th, became known as Black Tuesday. I also know what day of the week Black Tuesday was on. I don't have so much on Main Street and banking. There's not much in the Centennial book. I think we all had ancestors who were affected by the Depression and gave 20-cent tips 50 years later, and they had a lot of money and they were afraid they weren't going to have money anymore. So, but what I'd like to talk about is the work groups. Depression was probably, or unemployment's 25 or 30%. And the federal government had programs where young men could go to a town and have housing and meals. And someone's going to be talking about this next Thursday, and I'm imagining they got $2 or $3 or $4 a day or something. But does anybody know that?
I think they got $5 either a week or a month.
Yeah, it was
required to send it home to their parents.
Right. So we're talking $100 a year or something like that. So times words. I meant to say in this, I never heard of anyone being proud of being in the CCC, and I'll come back to that here in a moment. But this town benefited, from the shoreline and the piers, the shelter houses, all the stonework down by the DNR, the athletic fields up at the school, including the tennis courts, by the way, and I think maybe partially the gymnasium. I know funds were used for that. I'm going to fumble this, but we should really appreciate those stone piers. Those are a magnificent landmark. I figure between a fraternity in Ames, in Iowa City, and Methodist, I've met people probably from every town in this state. And people know this town, and they know those piers. And so the town's known for those piers. It's probably easy to criticize those programs, and it's probably very easy to criticize those men. But again, nobody ever bragged about being in the CCC, and these men were at the bottom. But how many of us can say 100 years from now that we had an effect? And whoever had the foresight 100 years ago to do that, to have two, it's kind of our, this sounds corny, but it's kind of our version of the Statue of Liberty. These are national historical monuments, and rightly so. And, they're not just fishing piers. This is living history. Also in the Depression, or in the 30s, there's a severe drought throughout the Midwest. And down in Oklahoma and Kansas, you would have called this the Dust Bowl. Well, we don't call it that here, but it was like half normal rainfall or less for several years on end. The lake had been renamed Black Hawk in 1932. Does everyone know the reason why that was? Is that a hand? Are you you got Wall Lake ties too. The lake had several names, and most recently it was Wall Lake, and of course that caused confusion. I picture somebody being on a train and pulling into the depot, and it says Wall Lake on the depot, and they get out and the train leaves, and they're still an hour from Lake. Or you're going to Lake, I'm going to Wall Lake this weekend. Well, don't get out at Wall Lake, get out at Lakeview. I mean, vice versa, whatever I said. The county name was Sac, and that's an Indian tribe, and their best chief was Black Hawk, and so the name Black Hawk. So it's Lake Chief Black Hawk, and the statue outside is dedicated in 1934. And I'd always heard how he was on the shoreline, and 1934 is a big year. That's the piers, and it's the community building, and also the dedication of the statue made in Eastern Iowa. But this drought hits, and by 1936 the lake's drying up. And that's the words they use in the Centennial book, drying up. And that's when they get the idea to do the dredging project, and that's not an overnight project. That takes place from 1938 to 1941. And again, footage on that DVD you can get at the library, and I'd be glad to watch that with anybody. Again, I should have watched it. Should have looked for my dad again, eh? And what else about that? The lake's rededicated and restocked in 1941. When I was growing up, I heard nothing about the Winter Carnival. And I mean nothing. Maybe once and you forgot it or something. Big section in the Centennial book, about 5 pages. I was sent a DVD about 20 years ago. It's only about 10 minutes long. Didn't watch that either preparing for this, but I got it at home. You know, it seems obvious to me now. With a prolonged depression, and with the problems with the lake, and drought, and digging out the lake, this probably gave people something to look forward to, and to plan for, and to get out and be active, and to promote the town. The Winter Carnival. And this was a big deal. It goes on for 20 years. They don't have it the last 2 years of the war, but they even have it, it was one weekend in the winter, usually in January, even after Pearl Harbor, the 3rd year. So, there'd be skating competitions and races and hockey, dance out at Lakewood. There were skating champions, and there's a choreographer from out of state that kind of keeps an eye on this for 20 years. We had the ice block cutting equipment, of course, and I've heard that a big thing of this was the ice palace. And I think it was on the south side of the bay. It's basically a wall of ice, more than a palace. But
John, the picture's right up there.
Oh, right there. Well,
1941, I saw.
Yeah, well, there's a turret, and but being on the south side of the lake, the sun would shine through it in the winter, and then they'd have lights behind it at night. Was it on the north?
I was over here on the north side.
Very good.
They'd build it and melt, and the next day it would be gone.
So one weekend. Old man winter don't always cooperate. And about halfway through this 20-season run, you know, the ice would be slushy or it'd be too cold. And they started having an indoor component to this, and they had the new gym at that point. Or we call it the old gym. Musicals and comedies, kind of lighthearted fare and things. And it came to an end in the late 50s, and not so clear reasons, but they would have had the water carnival in the lake. And just kind of came to an end. I can be criticized for not having much about the war effort at home in the Second War. We would have had war bonds, U.S. bonds, and we would have had rationing like everywhere. And we had Red Cross here, and the women's groups, I'm sure, did things, but I guess there's not much specifically mentioned in our Centennial book. What is mentioned is, it said the Boy Scouts in 42 or 43 collected tin or aluminum, but not for what purpose. And when the world goes to war and the nation goes to war again, unemployment of young men is not an issue. And those barracks were empty, and they moved the work group barracks up to the school for vocational arts, i.e. welding, and with a view to making armaments, if necessary. Our talk's coming to an end, and there was a fine irony to me. I mentioned we needed the railroad for the gravel industry. It ain't a job for horses. And after the war, we're now becoming a car culture. And I mentioned that the gravel was used on all these roads in northwest Iowa and throughout the state. Well, the roads have improved so much, county and state roads, and now we got the federal interstate system over that past half century. And we get the road around the lake, by the way, in the 50s, that gets paved. If you have any reason to go around the lake, you got a sidewalk now. Why you'd want to do that? That's the end of the talk. But the irony is that as these roads were improved, then you don't need the train anymore. So I've taken a long way of saying you needed the trains for the gravel industry, and then the gravel industries build the roads. But then when you have good roads, you don't need the train. So the Healy home is where I grew up, south of town. And when I was growing up, there'd be like 2 freight trains a week. Then there were 2 freight trains a month. And then it got so infrequent that if you heard the train, you went to the window to see the train. But we'd walk to town on the tracks, and we'd put a penny on the tracks and get it smushed. And then I went away, but I came back to the farm a few times a year. And this one time when I came home, the rail was gone, and they'd straightened out the bend in the road where the crossing was. And where the track had been was a bicycle path. And that was the end of the Lakeview Railroad. I hope you got something out of this, and thank you.
Research since I asked him to, in 2 months, I think. Wasn't it 2 months you've done this research? Yeah.
55 years of research.
A lot of the things that he was talking about today, we have here in our museum. Well, he was talking about the Winter Carnival. There it is over there on that wall. Upstairs, there's another floor to this building. Upstairs, we have the Lakes baseball team. And we also have, is it Kenny Gardner with the Guy Lombardo. He went to high school here. I think someone said that Lawrence Welk played at Lakewood. Yeah. What? And you sat in the balcony. You were dancing. Oh, yeah.
In the old days. How old are you? What's worse is that I know the answer.
Judy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. One
Sure.
of them was the Lakes baseball team. Was that a combination of Wall Lake and Lakeview?
Yes.
Because I understand that the country singer Charlie Pride
Yes.
played on that team and spent one summer living in Wall Lake working, I think, for the Fishers.
And, yeah.
And my other question was, well, I really, sometime I would like to have somebody explain to me how the park came to being and how the shoreline changed, you know, like, I think originally the lake came up like, almost like where underneath where Kevin Schmidt's grandparents lived, you know, where Kevin, Joe's house, you know, and then, but that was filled in. I mean, when did that happen?
That was the 30s dredging.
In the 30s dredging?
They put the dredging there.
Wasn't the
Chief
30s?
Blackhawk used to be on the edge to come up through Chief Blackhawk.
Okay, and then the other thing I think I've always kind of had a question about was the train brought people to town and then they went down to the shoreline and took a steamer out to Lakewood. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. There's several pictures of the steamer upstairs.
Say on that last section, you just remind me, it's not in the Centennial book, but sometime in the last year, I've seen it said that the high water mark for passenger train traffic, there were 2 trains a day from the north and 2 trains a day from the south. And they came in, one from each direction, like early or mid-morning, and then went the opposite way, and then same thing in the early afternoon. And but it said that on the last train, it departed north, and on that train was Floyd Parkinson. And I was going to say that I knew Parky, and I think he did it just for the fun of it, because when he got to Sac, a friend met him in a car and drove him back here. So he's gone about over half an hour. Saturday, April 15th, 1950 is the last passenger.
1950, okay, thank you.
As I said, we had another floor to the museum if you'd like to explore it now. The museum is closed for the season. However, if you have company coming or if you want to see the museum at any time, our phone numbers are on the door. Board members will be glad to open the museum for you. And it's a favorite with out-of-town visitors. Just love. I think there's more out-of-town people who've been here than people who live here. But I've shown the museum in the middle of a snowstorm when there was nothing for people to do, so they came to the museum. But usually there is one of us that can show you through. I have a favorite story that I tell to everybody who comes to the museum. It's about Floyd Parkinson's furniture store used to be J.P. Thurkelson's. And J.P. Thurkelson had a general store in Des Moines. He thought it would be better in Lakeview. So he closed his store in Des Moines and brought all of his inventory up to Lakeview by train, by railroad. And he had 2 cars full of inventory. And for 2 years he sold out of the train cars while the Husk building, now the Bogue building, it's being restored. It was being built for his general store. His grandson told me that he was quite a promoter. And one time he had this big sale, and he ran an ad in the newspaper, and he said, come to J.P. Thurkelson's on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock because we're having this big sale. And he was on the roof of the store holding up items to sell, and then someone would buy it and he'd throw it off the roof. So that's a little bit of history about our building that's being restored right now. So visit the museum at any time. Thank you for coming. There's coffee and cookies, and thanks for coming.